They had grown used to cold barracks and fixed routines, to temperatures that changed with the weather and could not be argued with. Yet one afternoon inside an American home near the camp, they noticed a small metal box mounted on the wall. And when someone casually turned a dial and the room began to warm almost immediately, the prisoners stood in silence, struggling to understand how comfort itself could be adjusted with a simple twist of the hand. The moment passed quickly, yet its meaning lingered long after they returned to the camp. The small metal device had seemed insignificant at first glance, no larger than a pocket watch mounted against painted plaster, yet the quiet confidence with which it had been adjusted unsettled their assumptions. The American homeowner had not spoken dramatically about it, nor had he demonstrated it with pride. He had simply reached out, turned the dial slightly, and resumed conversation as warm air began to circulate through the room with steady predictability. For the prisoners, accustomed to buildings that surrendered entirely to the season, the idea of regulating temperature with such precision felt unfamiliar. In many of the towns they had known before the war, heating was centralized, inflexible, and dependent on fuel availability. Rooms were either cold or overheated, depending on the hour and the condition of the furnace. Adjustment meant adding wood, opening windows, or waiting patiently. The concept of selecting a specific degree of comfort and trusting a mechanism to maintain it seemed almost excessive. Inside the American house, the warmth increased gradually, not in a sudden rush, but in a controlled flow that suggested calculation rather than improvisation. Air moved through hidden vents along the floor, evenly distributed rather than concentrated near a single stove. The system did not demand constant supervision. It functioned quietly in the background, responding to the setting on the wall without further attention. The simplicity of the interaction concealed the complexity of the engineering behind it. One of the prisoners later remarked that what unsettled him was not the warmth itself, but the assumption embedded in the design. The house had been built with the expectation that occupants would desire consistent comfort regardless of weather. The device on the wall implied a belief that indoor climate should be stable, measured, and adjustable at will. It suggested planning that extended beyond survival toward refinement. When they discussed it among themselves that evening, the conversation remained measured. Some suspected that such systems were common only in certain regions or among wealthier households. Others wondered whether the device was fragile, whether it required constant repair or expensive fuel. Yet the homeowner's casual demeanor suggested that it was neither rare nor delicate. It was integrated into the rhythm of daily life. Their barracks, by contrast, responded directly to the elements. Cold nights pressed through wooden walls, and warmth depended on shared stoves whose heat radiated unevenly. There was no dial to consult, no numerical scale promising equilibrium. Temperature was experienced collectively, endured rather than adjusted. The difference was not merely technical, it reflected expectation. During subsequent work details, they noticed similar devices in other homes, mounted in hallways or near door frames, consistent in shape and placement. Each one represented the same quiet principle: control through mechanism. No visible labor accompanied the adjustment. No firewood was stacked or carried. The action required only a turn of the wrist. Over time, the prisoners began to interpret the thermostat as more than a convenience. It symbolized a relationship with environment shaped by predictability and infrastructure. The system assumed steady fuel supply, reliable maintenance, and buildings designed to distribute air efficiently. It suggested stability not only of temperature, but of resources. As they lay in their bunks that night, the memory of the dial returned. They remained confined, their own surroundings governed by schedule and regulation rather than preference, yet the image of that small metal box lingered. It embodied an idea unfamiliar to many of them: that comfort could be calibrated, that climate within walls need not mirror climate outside. And in that realization, the device on the wall became more than a tool. It became a quiet illustration of how differently daily life could be structured on the other side of the fence. In the days that followed, the memory of that small metal dial refused to fade, and what at first seemed like a simple household feature began to take on a deeper significance in their conversations. During another work assignment near a residential street, the prisoners once again entered a home to repair a damaged fence panel, and almost instinctively their eyes scanned the interior walls until they located the familiar rectangular device mounted at shoulder height. This time, one of the men paid closer attention to the numbers printed around its edge, arranged neatly in ascending order, suggesting that comfort itself could be measured and selected with deliberate precision. The homeowner noticed their interest and explained briefly, in calm and practical terms, that the thermostat signaled the furnace to activate when the temperature dropped below the chosen setting and to stop once the desired warmth was reached. There was no dramatic explanation, no technical lecture, just a matter-of-fact description that implied reliability. The device functioned automatically, adjusting without constant supervision. For the prisoners, accustomed to responding directly to cold by adding fuel or layering clothing, the notion that heat could respond independently to a setting seemed almost abstract. Back at the camp, heating remained communal and reactive. When the air turned colder, someone fed the stove. When it grew too warm near the source, windows were opened slightly to balance the uneven distribution. The process required continuous human attention, and comfort was negotiated collectively rather than individually. There was no fixed number to consult, no assurance that the room would stabilize at a chosen point. It fluctuated with the weather and the diligence of those tending the fire. The thermostat, by contrast, represented delegation of control to mechanism. It removed the need for constant monitoring, allowing occupants to focus on other aspects of life while the system maintained equilibrium in the background. The idea unsettled some of the prisoners not because it was intimidating, but because it revealed an assumption of stability that felt distant from their own circumstances. Reliable fuel supply, insulated walls, and consistent infrastructure were prerequisites for such automation. The device was only the visible surface of a broader network functioning unseen. As they continued observing homes during subsequent assignments, they noticed that the thermostat's placement was standardized, often in central hallways where air circulated evenly. Its presence was neither decorative nor concealed. It was simply integrated into the architecture. This regularity suggested that the design was not experimental but common practice, reinforcing the impression that adjustable comfort was an ordinary expectation. In quiet conversations that evening, some prisoners reflected on how differently they had perceived temperature before capture. In military quarters or field barracks, weather dictated routine. Cold demanded endurance, heat demanded adaptation, and neither was subject to negotiation. The thermostat introduced a different philosophy, one in which environment could be moderated rather than endured. It signaled a shift from reacting to climate towards shaping it. What lingered most was the absence of visible effort. No smoke rising from a stove at the moment of adjustment, no scramble for additional fuel, only a silent response hidden within walls and ducts. The warmth arrived gradually and evenly, as if summoned by intention alone. For men whose daily life was defined by visible labor and immediate cause and effect, this quiet automation felt almost improbable. That night, as the temperature in the barracks dipped unevenly with the outside air, the contrast became more pronounced. They adjusted blankets, shifted positions closer to the stove, and accepted the fluctuations as part of routine. Yet somewhere beyond the fence, a dial on a wall maintained steady warmth without supervision. The difference was not merely technical. It reflected two distinct relationships with environment, one rooted in endurance, the other in calibrated control. By the third week of noticing thermostats in nearly every house they entered, the men no longer reacted with visible surprise. Yet their curiosity had deepened rather than faded. What had begun as astonishment at a wall-mounted dial gradually evolved into a broader awareness of how infrastructure shaped daily expectations. During a work detail inside a modest home undergoing minor repairs, one of the prisoners lingered near the hallway long enough to hear the furnace activate on its own, a low, steady hum rising beneath the floorboards as the thermostat responded to a subtle drop in temperature. No one had touched it. No one had issued instructions. The system simply functioned. That quiet activation unsettled him more than the initial demonstration. The warmth arrived not as a reaction to visible effort, but as a preemptive correction. The house did not wait to become uncomfortable before adjusting. It anticipated change and corrected it automatically. This idea, though technical in nature, carried psychological weight. It suggested an environment in which discomfort was not endured until unbearable, but moderated before it intensified. Back at the camp, temperatures still governed behavior rather than the reverse. Cold mornings required earlier stoking of the stove. Drafts near the walls were accepted as unavoidable. Heat, when it accumulated unevenly near the source, created pockets of discomfort that could not be easily corrected. The contrast was subtle but persistent. In one setting, human effort constantly responded to shifting conditions. In the other, a system absorbed that burden invisibly. As conversations continued in the barracks, the thermostat became a symbol of something larger than comfort. It represented predictability. Reliable fuel supply, insulated construction, and engineered distribution of air were not improvised solutions. They reflected planning that assumed continuity. The device on the wall was only the visible interface of a deeper network that functioned with consistency. The prisoners began to realize that what surprised them most was not the mechanism itself, but the expectation that such regulation was normal. Some speculated about the cost and complexity of maintaining such systems. Others wondered how widespread they truly were beyond the town surrounding the camp. Yet repeated exposure suggested that they were not rare luxuries reserved for exceptional households. They were integrated into modest homes as well, implying that adjustable indoor climate was an ordinary standard rather than an extravagance. During one assignment in a school building, the prisoners observed multiple thermostats along the corridors, each governing a separate zone. The idea that different sections of a single structure could be regulated independently added another layer of astonishment. Temperature was no longer a uniform condition imposed by a single stove, but a calibrated variable distributed with intention. The building's occupants moved through hallways that maintained steady warmth without visible intervention. That evening, lying on their bunks, the men reflected on how deeply environment influences behavior. In settings where temperature fluctuates unpredictably, energy is directed toward adaptation. Clothing is adjusted repeatedly. Tasks are timed according to warmth or cold. In settings where climate is stabilized, attention can shift elsewhere. The thermostat, in its quiet functionality, freed mental space otherwise occupied by vigilance against discomfort. The fence still defined the limits of their world, and the barracks remained subject to the season. Yet beyond those boundaries, warmth responded to a number printed on a dial. The prisoners could not ignore the symbolic dimension of that difference. One system required constant human reaction. The other relied on engineered anticipation. And in recognizing that contrast, they understood that the small device on the wall represented more than convenience. It embodied a philosophy of control through design, one that shaped daily life as surely as any visible rule or regulation. By the fourth assignment inside residential buildings, the thermostat no longer appeared as an isolated curiosity, but as a predictable fixture integrated into architecture itself. The prisoners began noticing how its placement corresponded with the structure of the home, positioned in central hallways where air from different rooms converged, suggesting that even its location had been calculated for accuracy. It was not decorative nor concealed. It was positioned openly, intended to be consulted without ceremony. During one repair detail in a larger house, the men observed how the thermostat was adjusted slightly as evening approached, not in response to immediate discomfort, but in anticipation of falling temperatures outside. The homeowner turned the dial before the chill fully settled, trusting the system to compensate gradually. This preemptive action reinforced the idea that climate control was not reactive but predictive. Comfort was maintained through foresight rather than endurance. The prisoners found themselves discussing the psychological implications of such a system. In their barracks, cold was something to brace against. Blankets were layered as needed. The stove was tended when necessary. Each adjustment required visible effort and collective awareness. In contrast, the thermostat delegated that vigilance to machinery. Once set, it operated quietly, requiring minimal attention. The difference extended beyond mechanics into expectation. One environment required constant human intervention, the other allowed attention to drift toward other concerns. They also began noticing how consistently the air circulated in American homes. Heat did not radiate from a single point, but seemed evenly dispersed through hidden ducts. The absence of sharp temperature gradients between rooms suggested planning at the construction stage. Walls were insulated, windows sealed tightly. The entire structure cooperated with the system. The thermostat was not an isolated invention. It functioned as part of an integrated design. During a work detail at a public building, the men observed multiple thermostats controlling separate sections. The idea that different spaces within the same structure could maintain distinct settings struck them as particularly sophisticated. It implied attention to usage patterns, occupancy, and efficiency. Even without understanding the full engineering behind it, they sensed that such systems required infrastructure far beyond the visible dial. Conversations in the barracks shifted from astonishment to analysis. Some speculated about fuel supply chains capable of sustaining consistent heating across entire neighborhoods. Others considered how insulation and construction standards reduced energy loss. The thermostat had opened a window into a broader network of reliability that extended well beyond the walls of a single home. What lingered most was the absence of visible strain. No frantic effort accompanied seasonal change. No sudden scramble occurred when temperatures dipped. The system absorbed fluctuations quietly. For men whose daily routine remained governed by weather and limited resources, that quiet stability felt distant and almost abstract. As autumn deepened and cooler nights returned to the camp, the difference sharpened. The barracks cooled unevenly, and blankets became more tightly drawn. The stove required renewed attention. Outside the fence, thermostats clicked softly in hallways, maintaining steady warmth without fanfare. Lying awake one evening, several prisoners reflected on how the small metal device had shifted their perception of domestic life beyond the wire. It represented more than convenience. It symbolized a relationship with environment built on anticipation, engineering, and sustained supply. Within the camp, climate was endured collectively. Beyond it, climate was calibrated individually. The fences still stood, and confinement remained unchanged. Yet the thermostat on the wall continued to represent a subtle but persistent contrast, illustrating how infrastructure and expectation combine to shape daily experience in ways that are not always immediately visible but are profoundly felt. By the fifth time they found themselves inside a heated building beyond the fence, the thermostat no longer provoked surprise, yet it had become a quiet reference point in their understanding of life outside captivity. During a repair assignment in a modest town office, one of the prisoners noticed how the dial had been set deliberately between two marked numbers, suggesting that comfort was not absolute but adjustable according to preference. The occupant had chosen a range that felt right, neither too warm nor too cool, and trusted the mechanism to maintain that balance without constant correction. That detail lingered. The idea that temperature could be fine-tuned according to personal preference implied a level of autonomy absent from camp life. In the barracks, warmth was shared and uneven, subject to the limitations of space and fuel. No individual could decide that his immediate surroundings should be slightly warmer or cooler. The thermostat, by contrast, symbolized calibrated control, allowing inhabitants to shape their environment subtly and continuously. As they continued working, the men observed how the system functioned without drawing attention to itself. The furnace activated with a low hum and ceased just as quietly once equilibrium was reached. No smoke signaled its operation. No visible labor accompanied its response. It was a background presence, supporting routine rather than interrupting it. That seamless integration into daily life underscored how deeply such technology had been normalized. Back inside the camp, the contrast grew sharper as colder evenings approached. The stove required regular tending, and heat radiated unevenly from its source. Those seated nearest felt warmth quickly, while those farther away waited longer. Adjustments required coordination and cooperation, and even then the results varied. Comfort was communal and imperfect, dependent on shared effort. The thermostat suggested an alternative relationship with environment, one rooted in predictability and infrastructure rather than adaptation alone. It implied steady fuel supply, insulated construction, and maintenance systems operating beyond the visible space of a single room. The small dial on the wall represented the visible interface of a much larger network functioning consistently. In quiet discussions, some prisoners acknowledged that what unsettled them most was not the technology itself, but the expectation behind it. A home equipped with such a device assumed continuity, reliability, and planning. It reflected a society confident enough in its supply lines and engineering to standardize comfort. The device was modest in size, yet expansive in implication. As they lay in their bunks that night, adjusting blankets against the chill, the image of the thermostat returned once more. They remained confined, their own climate determined by weather and shared resources. Beyond the fence, however, a simple turn of a dial ensured stability within walls. The difference did not diminish the reality of captivity, but it illuminated how daily life outside was structured around controlled conditions rather than constant adjustment. Over time, the thermostat ceased to be merely a curiosity and became a symbol of a broader contrast between endurance and calibration. One environment required constant human response to fluctuation. The other absorbed fluctuation through design. And in that small device mounted quietly on a wall, the prisoners recognized once again how infrastructure shapes experience in ways that are subtle, consistent, and deeply influential. In the end, the thermostat did not alter the fences that surrounded them, nor did it soften the certainty of confinement. Yet the small dial mounted quietly on American walls remained fixed in their memory long after the work details ended. What had first seemed like a curious mechanical convenience gradually revealed itself as a symbol of something deeper, a relationship with environment built on anticipation rather than endurance. Inside the camp, temperature was accepted as a condition to manage collectively. Cold required extra blankets and careful tending of the stove. Heat demanded patience and adjustment of clothing. Fluctuation was normal, and comfort was negotiated within limitation. Beyond the fence, however, warmth responded to a number selected deliberately. Climate did not dictate behavior in the same way. It was moderated, stabilized, and held steady through hidden systems. The thermostat's significance lay not in its metal casing or printed scale, but in the expectation it embodied. It assumed reliable fuel, insulated walls, and infrastructure that functioned consistently without constant oversight. It reflected confidence in continuity, planning, and maintenance. The act of turning a dial implied that stability could be trusted to follow. For men accustomed to environments shaped by weather and scarcity, that assumption carried weight. It illustrated how daily life outside captivity was structured around predictable conditions rather than reactive adjustments. Comfort was not improvised moment by moment. It was engineered into the background of routine. The fences remained firm, the gates closed each evening, and their status did not change. Yet in observing how a household could regulate its own climate with quiet precision, the prisoners encountered another subtle contrast between endurance and calibration. Within their barracks, warmth depended on effort and cooperation. Within American homes, it depended on systems designed to anticipate and correct. Years later, some might remember not only the stove in the corner of the barracks, but also the silent click of a thermostat activating somewhere beyond the wire. It was a small detail, easily overlooked, yet it revealed how profoundly infrastructure shapes daily experience. And in that simple adjustment of temperature, the men recognized once more that even the most ordinary objects can illuminate the distance between two worlds existing side by side in the same war. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.